Chapter 2 Materialismandthe Scencofsociety, the materialist conception of history, the general theory of the motive forces and laws of social change. Developed on the basis of Marx's discoveries, is known as the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. It was arrived at by applying the materialist world outlook to the solution of social problems. And because he made this application, materialism was with Marx no longer simply a theory aimed at interpreting the world, but a guide to the practice of changing the world, of building a society without exploitation of man by man. Above all, historical materialism has a contemporary significance. It is applicable here and now. It leads to conclusions not only about the causes of past events but about the causes of events now taking place, and therefore about what to do, about what policy to fight for, in order to satisfy the real needs of the people. When modern industry was created, there were created the means to produce enough to satisfy fully the needs of every human being, and therefore to realize the age-old dream of universal plenty. The means exist to do it. And the materialist conception of history, by explaining how social relations change and how modern industry came about, shows how it can be done. It is precisely in this contemporary application that historical materialism demonstrates its scientific character. For the final test of social science, as of all other science, is in its practical application. If historical materialism makes history 14 into a science, this is because it is not only a theory about how to interpret history but also a theory about how to make history, and therefore the basis for the practical policy of the revolutionary class which is making history today. Social relations and the laws of social development. Materialism means explaining what takes place in the material world from the material world itself. The materialist approach to explaining processes of nature means investigating those processes themselves in order to discover their laws of operation. And because human affairs are part of the material world, the materialist approach to explaining social events means likewise investigating social processes in order to discover their laws of operation. Such investigation must be empirical and scientific. It is not a question of deducing anything about society from the general philosophical principles of materialism, but of applying the normal methods of science, the framing and testing of theories or hypotheses, to the study of society. This is the foundation on which the theory of historical materialism rests. As Engels put it in his speech at Marx's graveside, just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. It is a discovery of science, made and verified by applying scientific methods differing not at all from those applied with equal success in other branches of science. In the opening pages of the German ideology, Marx and Engels remarked that the first premise of all human history is the existence of living human individuals. Thus the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. But the subject matter of social science is not the physiology and psychology of human individuals, their individual activities and reactions. That is taken for granted. Human individuals create and sustain society and the typical products of society by entering into social relations with one another. And it is these social relations which are the subject matter of social science. In the last analysis, when we say that certain social relations 15 have been formed and certain social phenomena produced, we are referring to what numbers of unspecified human individuals do in association. For instance, if we speak of commodity production, we are referring to how they organize their productive activity and distribute its products. If we say that a certain idea has arisen, we are referring to how they speak and act. If we say that certain institutions have been set up, we are referring to how they regulate their affairs. Social science abstracts from the individuals and deals with the social relations. It is not concerned with individual but with aggregate humanity. Of course, some individuals do occupy a special individual position within social relations. For many social relations depend on placing individuals in special positions: kings, chairmen of boards, presidents, popes and archbishops, leaders of movements, and so on. The individual decisions and actions of those individuals may have wide social repercussions. The character and extent of these must depend, however, upon the social relations within which they are acting. The key problems which social science has to unravel are not problems of the actions and motivations of individuals but problems of the interdependence of social relations. Social relations change and develop. The problem of how such change and development is brought about and of the laws which govern it, the main problem of the scientific understanding of society and its history, is the problem of analyzing and sorting out the interdependence of social relations. What are called laws regulating society and its development are simply generalized statements of such interdependence. For instance, what is the famous law of supply and demand in economics but a statement of the dependence of the terms of sale upon the relations of sellers and buyers? The sellers bring certain goods to market and the buyers come there with certain requirements and means of paying. That is a social relation between people as sellers and buyers. When the sale is effected and money changes hands, that is also a social relation. The law of supply and demand states the dependence of the latter relationship on the former. It is entirely and exclusively concerned with the interdependence of certain social relations. No one would deny that some social relations are regulated by laws. In particular, when products are produced as commodities, economic laws are discoverable regulating their production and exchange. But it has been and still is strenuously denied that there are invariable laws of social development operating throughout human history, in terms of which we can explain how and why social development in general takes place. In support of this denial, it is argued that because each event in human history is unique, and exactly the same circumstances are never repeated, therefore there is no basis for the discovery of invariable laws governing social changes. We can speak, for instance, of the laws of mechanics governing the motions of bodies, because the same mechanical interaction is repeated over and over again. But not so with the events of human history. This argument rests on an obvious confusion. Of course every event, whether in nature or society, is unique. But in society, as in nature, the same kind of event, for instance, a revolution, is often repeated. And variants of the same social relations are repeated over and over again. All the conditions are present, therefore, for the discovery of laws. Despite all the manifold changes of society, there are certain general relations which are always present in varying forms, because these are basic relations without which no society at all can exist. And from the study of such relations, general laws always applicable to the development of any society emerge. The foundations of social science. It is evident that social relations cannot, like many relations of nature, be studied experimentally. The social scientist cannot set up social relations experimentally in order to discover how they operate. Nor can he experimentally separate some social relations from others, for purposes of study. He is himself a member of society, and has to take it as he finds it, in all its baffling complexity. Marx remarked on this difficulty in the 7 Preface to Capital, where he contrasted the investigation of social changes with that of, say, chemical changes. In Social Analysis, he wrote, "Neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use. The force of abstraction must replace both. That is to say, where it is not possible to separate certain relations experimentally, they must be separated in the mind of the investigator." Marx's discovery of the fundamental laws of social development was reached by asking whether any relations can be distinguished which must always be present in any form of society, because they are the condition for any form of social life whatever. Once such relations are abstracted, then hypotheses can be put forward about their interdependencies, and these can be checked against the actual social record. The whole development of society is then explained as regulated by the laws of interdependence so formulated. Such was Marx's method. When the key question is asked, the answer becomes strikingly obvious. The necessary condition for any society is that man should associate to produce their material means of subsistence. Without this collective action of men on nature, there is no human life. It constitutes the very essential of the human mode of life. The process of social production is, therefore, the primary process of all social life. It is primary in this precise sense, that social life begins with it, that it is present continuously throughout all social life, and that no other social activity or social relation can occur unless this primary activity, this primary social relation, sustains it. From this beginning, Marx went on to frame a general hypothesis, consisting of several interconnected propositions, which together may be said to constitute a general law of social development. The theory will be stated here only in barest outline. It will be reviewed in more detail, and its more important consequences discussed, in the ensuing chapters. In order to carry on production, people must enter into relations of production. These are concerned with property in means of production, and with the mode of distribution of the product, and in their totality they define the economic 18 structure of society. 2. People enter into relations of production, and so associate in an economic organization, independent of any conscious decision but corresponding to the character of their productive forces. That is to say, people who depend for their subsistence on certain production techniques evolve property relations, and eventually class relations, appropriate to those techniques. For instance, a primitive hunting tribe will live the social life of primitive communism. When animals are domesticated, the herds will tend to become the property of particular families within the community. When power-driven machinery is first introduced, it is as the property of capitalists who employ wage labor, and so on. 3. Social institutions, and with them prevailing systems of ideas, will then arise corresponding to the economic structure of society. They will be such as to serve the carrying on of the prevailing mode of production. For instance, a primitive tribe could hardly possess a legislative assembly, or a standing army and police force, or universities. On the other hand, such institutions are required for carrying on a modern capitalist society. Only when a certain economic basis exists do such institutions, with their corresponding ideologies, arise. These three propositions make up the key to explaining how social development proceeds and how the various historical features of society arise and change. Corresponding to certain forces of production, certain relations of production come into being. Within these production relations, new forces of production eventually develop. Then the situation arises when, in Marx's words, the old production relations begin to act as fetters upon the further development of production. The relations of production have then to be changed, and the whole superstructure of ideas and institutions is changed with them. The theory thus postulates a law of interdependence between production, the relations of production, and the social superstructure of institutions and ideas. And it is a hypothesis which can be checked against the known facts and is verified by them. Indeed, it is hard to imagine how anything different could arise in society. Could production relations arise weakly were inappropriate to the given forces of production? Or when they become fetters on production, would it be possible to avoid a struggle for new production relations? Again, could a society survive, the institutions of which failed to serve its basic economic processes? Could such institutions possibly be formed? And when such institutions grow outmoded, would it be possible to avoid a struggle to change them? If we ask such questions as these, the laws formulated by Marx begin to have the same obvious and compelling look as, for instance, the laws of thermodynamics. One might as well ask whether a physical system could create energy from nothing. If an engine were built which ran without fuel, or could do more work without more fuel, that would falsify the laws of thermodynamics. And if a society were created each kept going without production, or in which economic structure was not adapted to production and social superstructure to economic basis, that would falsify historical materialism. But there is no such engine, and no such society. Such fundamental laws of science are always verified by all the relevant facts, and no instances which would falsify them are ever to be found. Historical materialism supplies a foundation for social science in much the same way as the theory of evolution by natural selection supplies a foundation for biological science. Whatever species may be considered, it evolved by natural selection and that conditions its entire character. Similarly, whatever society may be considered, it came to be what it is by adaptation of production relations to production, and of ideas and institutions to production relations. Indeed, Darwin arrived at the theory of natural selection by very much the same method of abstraction as Marx, more or less simultaneously, employed in the theory of historical materialism. Darwin's theory grew from the fundamental consideration that every species lives by adaptation to an environment, just as Marx's theory grew from the consideration that every society lives by a mode of production. But the same type of abstraction is employed in all fundamental scientific theory. Newton, for example, employed it in arriving at his 20 formulation of the laws of motion. The condition of existence of any body at any instant is that it has a certain motion of its own and is acted on by external forces. Marx employed it a second time in his special investigation, in Capital, of commodity production. He began that investigation with the consideration that the one thing all commodities have in common is that they are products of human labor, and that therefore what people are doing when they exchange commodities is to exchange the products of definite quantities of social and accessory labor time. General laws and particular events. All fundamental scientific theory is very general in character and, consequently, very flexible. It can show the same general connections holding in circumstances so widely different that there appear to be no such connections. It can explain the operations of a large variety of particular causes, and recognize in particular instances the operation of particular causes which could not have been forecast in terms of the general laws alone. Historical materialism shares this breadth and flexibility. Just as Darwinism can account for many odd features of species in terms of particular causes operating within the general process of natural selection, so Marxism can account for the most varied social phenomena in terms of particular causes operating within the general process of adaptation of relations of production to production. It is no objection to the theory to say that it is incapable of predicting such particular causes. The point is that it is capable of explaining them and their effects within the general process of social evolution. For example, in the development of English society under the Tudors, it so happened that a particular quarrel arose between Henry III and the Pope, because Henry wanted to divorce his wife and the Pope refused permission. Henry broke with the Pope, and this gave him an excuse to confiscate the church lands and divide them amongst his cronies, an action which had very far-reaching economic and political consequences. There is no law of social development in accordance with which Henry was bound to become dissatisfied with his 21 wife and quarrel with the Pope about it. On the contrary, these particular events which had such large effects arose from particular causes which could not be deduced from any general laws and were relatively accidental. But the fact that Henry was able to take advantage of these events, that he could get away with the confiscation of church lands, and that these actions brought about changes within class relations, all that is explicable only through the contradictory social relations which had come into being at that particular period. Moreover, in other places where similar social contradictions existed, similar economic and political changes were effected. Other European monarchs, who had no trouble with their wives, were making the same break with the Church and its institutions, as a result of the same deep-seated and general causes, though the individual circumstances and causes varied greatly in different cases. The laws which regulate the development of social relations operate through the relatively accidental circumstances and actions of the individuals who live within those social relations. But the laws are not some kind of fate externally imposed upon human individuals. It is the very life process of the individuals, the fact that they are human, which leads to their entering into relations which exhibit those laws. Just as the attractions and repulsions of the elements of a physical system lead to their entering into various combinations, so the dependence of human individuals one upon another, and of all on their joint action on nature, leads to their entering into social relations and to the development of those social relations. Thus human society develops through a succession of relatively accidental events, all of which can be traced to their particular causes and have their particular effects, and each in their totality present a log-of-aimed process of the development of social relations. Human intentions and objective law. Society consists of human beings, and there is therefore an essential distinction between social processes and natural processes. In nature there are only blind, unconscious 22 agencies acting upon one another, wrote Engels and Ludwig Feuerbach. In the history of society, on the other hand, the actors are all endowed with consciousness, are men acting with deliberation or passion, working towards definite goals. Nothing happens without a conscious purpose, without an intended aim. Social effects are brought about by the conscious, intentional activity of human beings, who choose what they will do. And this circumstance has sometimes been held to be incompatible with the view that social development is regulated by objective laws. If, it is argued, social development depends upon human intelligence, choice and will, it cannot be regulated by laws. Yet the conclusion does not follow. For the fact that people change their social relations by their own voluntary actions does not imply that in these changes there are no general laws of the interdependence of social relations. On the contrary, whenever people enter into certain relations, this fact influences other of their relations. Within the totality of changing social relations there are laws of interdependence, and people cannot establish or change their relations just as they like. When we consider people's desires and intentions, in their social context, we should ask, what influences their intentions and their choices, and what determines the outcome of their intentional actions? For people do not set aims before themselves regardless of their circumstances. And when people choose what to do and act with certain intentions, the results of their actions are often not what they intended. Clearly, therefore, it is not possible to explain the actual development of society simply from the intentions in the minds of the members of society. The ideas in men's minds, the aims they set themselves, and the emotions they feel, arise in response to their material conditions of existence, which include relationship with nature and relationship with one another in society. The forces bringing about social change are not ideas, or aims in the abstract, nor abstract individuals each of whom decides independently what he will do, but, as Marx and Engels put it in the German ideology, real, active men, as they are conditioned 23 by a definite development of their productive forces and of OUI intercourse corresponding to these. And they form their ideas and aims on the basis of their real-life process. It is the necessary condition of any human life that people should produce their means of subsistence, and that they should enter into production relations corresponding with their productive forces. This happens independent of anyone's idea or intention or choice. But possessing certain productive forces and living within certain production relations, people then form their ideas and intentions corresponding to these real-life conditions in which they find themselves. From these conditions arise definite interests, contradictions of interest, aims and ambitions. Ideas, passions, plans and intentions arise in the minds of individuals accordingly, in response to those conditions of life. And so social life proceeds. In a primitive hunting tribe, for instance, it is natural that the people's plans should be mostly confined to hunting, and that the height of any individual's ambition should be to become a chief. If, perhaps through some change of environment, they get an interest in cultivation or domestication of animals, then other plans, other ambitions arise. The people keep their society going by their own initiative and efforts. But the direction of their efforts is conditioned by their material mode of life. In a modern capitalist society, of course, conditions are far more complex and include profound social contradictions. When wage labor is employed, for instance, the workers have a common interest in improving their standards of life. The intention of doing so is born in their minds, and trade unions are organized to do it. Obviously, this is bound to happen. Trade union organization is as inevitable in capitalist society as it is inevitable that water will seek its own level. But trade unions are created by nothing but the workers' own efforts, by their acting on their own initiative, in a conscious intentional way, with each one choosing whether to join a trade union or not. The point is that the direction of the efforts is determined by the material conditions of life. At the same time, the capitalists will also be pursuing their own interests. Some 24 well-meaning people will be making proposals to reconcile conflicting interests. Some of the workers will be conceiving ambitions to raise their individual status by using trade union positions. Some of the capitalists will understand this and set about buying them out, and so on, and so on. A vast complex of differing and conflicting aims and ideas is born from the given conditions, and eventually the conditions are changed by the social activities of the people so motivated. What, then, determines the character of the changes? Not simply the socially conditioned intentions of the makers of change. For, as Engels wrote in Ludwig Feuerbach, numerous desired ends cross and conflict with one another, or these ends themselves are from the outset incapable of realization, or the means of attaining them are insufficient. Thus the conflict of innumerable individual wills and individual actions in the domain of history produces a state of affairs entirely analogous to that in the realm of unconscious nature. The many individual wills active in history for the most part produce results quite other than those they intended, often quite the opposite. Just as the material mode of production is the foundation for the various different motivations which develop within society, so it also determines which ends are practical and which are not, and what the eventual outcome of the conflicting motivations will be. The French Revolution, for example, was the explosive result of contradictions within the old society. From the position they occupied within the economic structure of that society, the peasants, town workers and rising bourgeoisie were all frustrated in the pursuit of their material interests, and all consequently oppressed under the rule of the nobility. They rose for liberty, equality and fraternity, and smashed the feudal fetters. But what resulted was something not intended by the majority of those taking part in the revolution. As soon as the feudal fetters were smashed, free scope was afforded to the economic activity of the bourgeoisie, and the result was the development of capitalism. Fighting for liberty, what they did was to give nascent capitalism the chance to consolidate 25 itself. This happened thanks to the initiative and efforts of the revolutionaries. But the final results of that initiative and those efforts depended on the sum total of social relations in French society. Thus, while society is composed of individuals who together make their own history by their own conscious activity, we must look behind people's conscious aims, intentions and motives to the economic development of society in order to find the laws of historical development. It is there that we discover the laws which regulate the changes in the circumstances conditioning people's actions, the transformations of material interests into conscious motives in their heads, and the final outcome of their activity. Men make their own history, wrote Maurce in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, chap. I. But they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. Like many other laws now known to science, the fundamental laws of social development, which regulate how these circumstances come into being and how they are changed, do not deal with the determination of individual events but with the consequences over a period of time of a large number of individual interactions. They state the consequences of individuals living in society. The intercourse of individuals in society must always lead to their using such productive forces as are to hand, to their entering into production relations corresponding to those productive forces, and to motivations and conflicts, based on those production relations, through which production relations are eventually changed corresponding to the development of new productive forces. The law of progress, the fundamental law of social development, is that of the adaptation of relations of production to production. The social relations of production have to be adapted to the social action of men on nature whereby men produce their means of life. The operation of this law brings about, with time, the progressive development of human society. That is, an irreversible progression from an earlier stage to a later stage. And that is because, from time to time, people are able to develop their forces of production. Given the actual physical, chemical and biological processes of the Earth's surface, and the presence of men, employing brain and hand to use those processes for their own ends, there exists the possibility of a progressive development of techniques, each of which is sooner or later explored, though a long time may pass before favorable conditions arise for such exploration. And from this development of forces of production follow corresponding modifications and changes in relations of production and in the entire superstructure of social relations based on the relations of production. Thus human societies develop from formations based on lower production techniques to those based on higher production techniques. The distance traversed from stone tools to the automated factory and the nuclear reactor is the measure of human progress to date. Progress, as so defined, cannot be due, as Hegel supposed human development was due, to any universal spirit mysteriously working itself out in human destinies and guiding them towards some end, any more than particular misfortunes and catastrophes that befall people are due to a malign fate manipulating human puppets towards their destruction. The whole conception of an external influence at work in human affairs, whether it is called the absolute spirit, God, fate, or merely the influence of the stars, makes very little difference, is an idealist conception, totally foreign to science and therefore to Marxism. The only agency which determines human affairs is the agency of people themselves, wresting their livelihood from nature and entering into social relations to do so. Thus determined, progress is naturally neither steady nor uniform. Important new techniques, such as the wheel, iron working, the use of water power, and so on, are introduced only at times and places where there occurs a coincidence of circumstances favorable to their discovery and application. But once introduced, new techniques bring power and benefits to their users which mean that they are not likely to be 27 given up. Once introduced, new techniques are not lost again, but go on being used and eventually serve as the basis for still higher techniques. Moreover, big changes in production and consequently in production relations tend to be localized, to occur at long intervals, and to spread from a given locality. In the history of mankind to date there have been two great changes in production of decisive importance. The first, which occurred only after hundreds of thousands of years of primitive techniques practiced by scattered tribes after the birth of the human species, was the introduction of agriculture. This led to the division of society into classes and to the stormy, though comparatively short, period of man's evolution in which man was exploited by man and his history became the history of class struggles. The second was the introduction of modern industry, based on the general use of sources of energy other than human or animal muscle power. This led to the extreme polarization of class relations under capitalism and the birth among the exploited of the irresistible movement towards communism. The production relations adapted to modern industry, once it has developed sufficiently, are those of communism. Thanks to modern techniques, which include means of transport and communication, and to the capitalist drive for profit, once capitalism became established in one region it very quickly reached out until it brought the whole world under its sway. Thus modern industry meant the end of the process in which social development was localized and progress confined to separate regions, and the beginning of a herald process of the advance of all humanity to classless communist society based on a uniformly high level of technique. Scientific theory and social practice. Knowledge of the laws of social development brings knowledge of the real forces at work in contemporary society and of how that society can and must be changed. When production is outstripping production relations, there arises a historical necessity of changing those relations in order that people can carry forward production and enjoy the benefits it is capable of bringing them. To effect this change is a 28 historical task. Such historical necessity and the corresponding historical task is an objective fact, completely independent of anyone's desires or intentions. To speak of it expresses not simply an aspiration or political program, clothed in grand words, but an actually existing setup of human relations. Capitalism contains such a necessity and such a task, the necessity and task of advancing to socialism. And within the capitalist relations, one class, the working class, is by virtue of its position within those relations the social force to carry out the job. In this sense we may speak of its having a historical mission. This is a fact, whether anyone knows it or not, and whether anyone talks anything about it or not. Marxism did not invent the historical mission of the working class, but discovered it. In a similar way, in the bourgeois revolution a necessity and a task existed, and the nascent bourgeoisie had the mission of establishing a new order of society, which they successfully did. In the course of time tasks are fulfilled, because the existence of the task means that circumstances conspire to impel people towards its fulfillment. If one generation fails, it remains for the next generation. Mankind sets itself only such tasks as it can solve, wrote Marx in the preface to Critique of Political Economy, since the task itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution already exist or are at least in the process of formation. The subject matter of social science is man's OWR and social activity, whereas natural science deals with the object of that activity, the materials and forces of nature. Hence social science differs from natural science in that, by its discovery of the laws of development of social activity, it defines the historical task facing mankind at a given time and, therefore, the social end or goal of activity. Natural science, on the other hand, is concerned solely with means. It shows how natural forces can be used, and that is all. Physics, for example, by discovering the laws of physical processes, enables us to use those processes for our own purposes, as means to our own ends. It does not define those ends. To define the historical task in contemporary society is, of 39 course, at the same time to make a prediction, namely, that that task is likely eventually to be fulfilled. Thus Marxism does make a definite prediction, that capitalism will not continue indefinitely, and that, barring the possible catastrophe of mankind using the recent discovery of nuclear energy to destroy itself, it will be superseded by world communist society. But prediction is never the main function of either natural or social science. It is only secondary to the main function, which is to enable us to regulate our social activity, in production and in other spheres, in the light of discovery of the objective properties and laws of nature and society. So while the discovery of the laws of social development docs imply a prediction about the future development of society, its primary significance is that it defines practical goals and practical policies towards realizing them. Those who fail to grasp this are confusing Marx with old Moore. In social activity, knowledge of the laws of development becomes itself a force in that development, and is enlarged and clarified as the development proceeds. Another peculiarity of social science as compared with natural science is that it discovers and defines its own reasons for existence. The very definition of the contemporary task explains why scientific knowledge, a scientific theory, is needed to enable the task to be fulfilled. All earlier social formations came into being through members of society spontaneously pursuing their own immediate interests, as these arose from an existing mode of production. Capitalism, for instance, was not created by people acting on any scientific theory of capitalism, but by people following their noses in circumstances favorable to the development of capitalist relations, as a result of which the members of the rising bourgeois class seized any opportunity for profit and acted in combination against anyone and anything that blocked them. With the working class in capitalist society, on the other hand, spontaneous action leads no further than organization to secure higher wages, shorter hours and better living conditions. To advance to socialism requires deliberate measures to change the relations of production, and the prior conquest of political power by the working class in order to be able to institute such measures. To do that requires theoretical knowledge of what is to be done, based on the scientific investigation of social processes, and a mass movement informed by scientific theory. Every revolutionizing discovery in history has been made only when conditions were ripe for it and the need for it existed. Thus the great discoveries of modern natural science were made only when the development of the mode of production had created the conditions and the need for them. The same is true of the social discoveries of Marx. The theory of the working class movement, the establishment of fundamental scientific theory in any field, has always meant the overthrow of old prejudices, and so has run up against the opposition of definite interests. This applies still more with the science of society. Marx's discovery showed how men form societies, and frame their ideas and principles, on the basis of the material process of production. This threw down the last stronghold of idealism, the conception of human consciousness as having its ultimate source in something other than the material world. And with it the whole idea of the sanctity, rationality and permanence of any human institutions. In particular, Marx's discovery demonstrated the contradictions of capitalism and the necessity of replacing it by socialism. Obviously, if social science demonstrates these conclusions, then not only does it meet with opposition, but it simply cannot be accepted at all within the capitalist order. Marxism arose as the theory of the working class movement, which alone needed such a theory, and within the ranks of which alone could it be worked out, accepted and used. And after socialism was victorious in some countries, it was developed further as the theory of socialism and communism. The so-called social science of the bourgeois establishment has of course had to admit by the back door, as it were, and usually without acknowledgement, some selected Marxist ideas. But the fundamental theory is consistently repudiated. In consequence, bourgeois social science remains at a primitive, descriptive 3 inches level, without fundamental theory. And as for the definition of social goals, these are treated as the subject of morals or religion or politics, as distinct from science. The use of Marxist theory to the working class movement is threefold. It arms the movement with scientific knowledge of the actual position of the working class. It enables the movement scientifically to formulate practical aims, and it guides the movement in working out the necessary strategy and tactics for achieving those aims. The working class movement cannot transform society without the benefit of fundamental theory. And this theory teaches it to keep practical goals in sight rather than dream of utopian ideals, and to base its policies not on general precepts and exhortations but on recognition of the real material conditions and needs of the people. In the application of science in the politics of class struggle, a distinction must be made between certain general and invariable principles, on the one hand, and particular policies framed to cope with particular situations and phases of struggle on the other. It is necessary to pursue a policy of working class struggle against the capitalist class, uniting always the maximum forces to defeat the main enemy. This struggle must be carried to the point where the working class, with its allies, is able to gain political power to establish socialism and overcome all resistance against it. And to achieve this position of power, the working class must be led by a political party dedicated to the aim of socialism and guided by scientific socialist theory. These are inviolable principles to abandon, which amounts in practice to abandoning the goal of socialism and the means to realize it. Within the framework of general principles there is then the problem of finding the right policies to meet each eventuality that arises. And here, it must be allowed, a large element of variation and improvisation comes in. Those dogmatists have a strange idea of applying social science, who imagine that it is possible to state in advance everything that is going to happen, and to lay down hard and fast rules for determining 32 correct policies. In the working class struggle it is possible and necessary to make an analysis of the salient facts of a given situation, to forecast the probable behavior of individuals, groups and classes in such a situation, and in the light of that to arrive at a plan of action. But at the same time, control is lacking over nearly all these factors. Even the way in which decisions taken within the movement are carried out depends on the tightness or looseness of organization, the waging of internal controversies, and all manner of subjective factors influencing individuals. Hence the contingent and the unforeseen always play a large part in the politics of class struggle, and a wise leadership is one which has no illusions of infallibility and is always on the alert to draw conclusions from new experiences. Social science and communism. The consolidation of socialism, followed by the evolution of socialism into communism, means the end of exploitation of man by man and with that the end of class struggles. Evidently, therefore, the future conditions of human social activity will, in that event, be very different from the past. So different will they be that Marx, in the preface to Critique of Political Economy, wrote that the transition to socialism brings the prehistory of human society to a close. With communism, as the Communist Manifesto put it, all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation. And then, to quote Engels in Socialism, utopian and scientific, man's own social organization, hitherto confronting him as a necessity imposed by nature and history, becomes the result of his own free action. The extraneous objective forces which have hitherto governed history pass under the control of man himself. It is then no longer a question of waging class struggle in conditions under which many factors determining the outcome are beyond control, but of planning the basic processes of social life for the satisfaction of human needs. This implies that the whole mode of application of social science is changed. Its application becomes a matter of 33 estimating the material needs cf society, and the current material and human resources available, and of planning production and distribution accordingly. Thus in its application social science becomes an exact, mathematical and quantitative discipline, like the natural sciences applied in the techniques of production. This change corresponds to the situation in which, as Engels also puts it, the government of persons has been replaced by the administration of things. The task of social science under communism is not to work out ways and means of manipulating human beings so as to force or cajole them into some predetermined pattern of social activity. The task is to work out the plan of production and distribution for the whole community, to be undertaken with the minimum of labor, so that people may on that basis really enjoy that blossoming forth of human energy which is for man an end in itself. Writing of the tasks of science in his early economic and philosophical manuscripts, Marx concluded, natural science will in time subsume under itself the science of man, just as the science of man will subsume under itself natural science. There will be one science. The subject of science will be the laws of development of nature and human society, and the ways and means of man's securing the continuous satisfaction in his social life of all his needs. The discovery of the fundamental laws of man's social activity was an essential step towards this unification of the sciences which is necessary as a means to securing the flowering of human life. 34th Chapter 3 T